All right, here we go. 13.4. It is titled The South People, and we're going to start you off and end the chapter right here today with this. Um, Keep this in mind. There's four main groups of people in the South, and the first one are the yeomen. So write this in. I want you to know that the yeomen were the largest group of all people in the South. They were the farmers without any slaves. They owned between 50 and 200 acres of land, and they also, obviously, they own land. Tenant farmers was another group, group number two. These were the groups that rented the land from maybe a plantation owner for a small fee. Rural people, these were the ones who lived in the woods. They were very self-sufficient. Typically, they would own maybe a slave, but doubtful at that. Plantation owners were a very small portion of the population. Now, this picture up here is not the typical thing you would see in the South. Very stereotypically, you would see this stuff in the movies, like everything's a plantation. That wasn't the case. Remember, most people were yeomans. They were farmers that owned between 5 and 200 acres, and they did not own slaves. But the plantation owners, about 4% of them owned 20 or more, and most of these plantation owners had about 10 or fewer slaves. All right, let's talk about plantations themselves. The goal of a plantation was to earn profits, selling cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, whatever it was. And by the way, I should back up and say that this right here is the famous picture of a yeoman, that largest group of people, farmers without servants. Back to plantations. All right, typically plantation owners would want to maximize their profits, right? So what they would do is they would store all their cotton in a warehouse until the price of that cotton went way up. It might be sitting in there for 3-4 months, but they knew the price would go up because in business things are cyclical. They go up and down. When the price was right, they sold it. They would have to be charged a little fee for being that good being held in there, but it wasn't a big deal to them. They would make more money and make up for it when the sale of the crop actually happened. Plantations were, in some cases, ran a little bit by wives who were like supervisors. They were typically the ones who watched over the slaves. They took care of the sick. Very important role. Some of them were even accountants. All right. Last point here. Work on the plantations typically was, oopsie, let's undo that. Were typically divided into groups. We had your domestic workers, we had your field hands, and you probably also had your overseer or your plantation manager. Now, this man right here would be the plantation manager. He'd make sure all the slaves were doing their jobs, and he definitely had the power to whip people. In fact, when I Google searched this, most of the overseers were ones that were beating slaves with a whip. So this is one of the only ones that I could find that was really, it showed a little more positive role there for the overseer. All right, next slide here. Okay, life under slavery. Doesn't take a brainiac to understand that this wasn't very easy work. You got no money, work was really hard. You'd be standing in rice fields, water up to your knee. You'd be combing cotton to get the seeds out, or you might be running a blacksmith shop because plantations were very self-sufficient. You had little hope of freedom, so it wasn't a very bright future being born as a slave. How did these slaves survive? Most of them relied on extended family. Now, I have a son and a daughter and a wife. That's 3 people. That is my immediate family. If I talk about my mom and dad, that's also my immediate family. My grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, those are the extended family members. They were very critical to survival on the plantations because sometimes your mom, your dad, your brother or sister would be sold off to another plantation owner or maybe a smaller farmer, and you had no control over that. You also never knew when that would happen. So you had to rely on those you were close to, and that's how they kind of got through the hard times. move on. Another thing that helped African Americans survive were spirituals. These are the famous names for the folk songs that they wrote. Okay? When we talk about life under slavery, it's also important to note slave codes. So, what are slave codes? Slave codes are Southern laws controlling slavery. Here's a list of examples, but the basic idea of a slave code was to prevent slave rebellion. So here's some things that these slave codes did. It allowed owners to whip and punish slaves for any reason. Slaves weren't allowed to hit white people. Slaves cannot buy goods. They can't leave without a permission slip. They cannot learn to read or write, and they must have a permission slip to marry. In a lot of cases, marriages weren't even legal, but they did it anyways. And one of the things they said was, until death do us part or separation, because like I said, you never knew when that slave owner might ship you off to a new owner. Definitely was some rebellion by the slaves. We'll talk about this man first. This is Nat Turner. In 1831, he held an uprising or a rebellion in Virginia. He was a former slave. He taught himself how to read and write. Okay, he was famous for killing 55 whites. Some of them were plantation owners or masters, and when he was caught, he was immediately hanged. This basically showed the entire South that armed conflict was impossible. Without the ability to communicate and read and write, and without money as a resource, how are you going to get the weapons and the resources needed to fight a war? You simply wouldn't have it. Final point. Point being, how could slaves resist some of this in servitude and these slave-like conditions? Well, one of the ways to do that was to work slowly and just act like that was your normal working speed. You could fake your illnesses, or you could even break tools. In some instances, they may even have set fire to warehouses or small buildings, and you bet they probably were punished for that. But some historians claim that that had actually helped make slavery a little bit better than it actually was, which is kind of sad. All right. Okay, final little section here on chapter 13, and you will be done. Please continue to make sure you're filling in all the blanks so you have a nice little outline to refer back to. All right, let's talk about escaping slavery. This was something that was very difficult to do. However, we have two really important and famous people to talk about. We will be talking about them more probably in the future. We have Harriet Tubman. Currently, her name is being kind of printed on the new $20 bill, and Andrew Jackson, goodbye. So obviously we know she had some very important role, not only in freeing slaves, but in U.S. history. This man here is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a famous abolitionist, who we will talk more about later on, but an abolitionist wanted to get rid of slavery, essentially. All right, so let me pull these pictures out of here. Not having a whole lot of success with that. There we go. Okay, now point B is, in order to escape slavery, which was extremely hard, people relied on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, who we just saw, is credited for helping 300 slaves reach their freedom on the Underground Railroad. This was a system of safe houses that ran from the south pretty much to the north, and eventually, after the Fugitive Slave Act, up into Canada, where they were finally safe. Okay. The people who ran the Underground Railroad, or the safe houses, they were called conductors, and obviously the slaves were called the passengers. All right, final point. Here's the thing. The Underground Railroad, most people were actually captured trying to use this, and most were whipped. Maybe not the railroad itself, but those that tried to escape were mostly captured and whipped as punishment. Some of them may have even been free African Americans. Yep, I said that right. Free African Americans would have been picked up off the street, and people would have blamed them before trying to escape, even though they might have free papers, and they would have been shipped down south and turned into a slave. That did happen. Final point is about city life and education. The main thing is it's going to be different than the North. We need to understand why and how. Okay, let's start with cities. The city of Baltimore, for example, would have 212,000 people by 1860, and the city of New Orleans would have 168,000 people by 1860. Now, the biggest cities in the North, remember New York and Philadelphia, were well over 500,000 people at the same time. We talked about reasons why that might have been, but we probably will get back at that again here, which I know we will. One of the major things that helped cities like Baltimore and New Orleans rise in size and in power was obviously railroads, just like in the North. But the important thing to note is it was to a lesser extent. We know that the railroad map showed only 1/3 of all railroads being in the South. Okay, let's move on to education. Education in the South was very different. There was less access to education. There were no public schools was one of the first things to note in the South. Southern literacy as a result would obviously be way lower than that in the North. A lot of kids were needed to help work on the farms. So literacy, the ability to read and write, was much lower in the South. This would have an effect on their economy and their economic success. We can still see that. It's a bad stereotype to say and point out, but we can still see today that people in the South, they tend to be, especially in the really rural areas, they tend to value education a little bit less, and a higher value is placed on entertainment. All right, so why is there so much difference between the North and the South? First reason, geography. Fewer people lived per square mile in the South. Okay, you can see the numbers that I wrote in here. In Virginia, which was the highest populated state actually, in the South, there was only 15 people per square mile. That's very low. If you look at Massachusetts, where the colonists really originated, the Pilgrims, Puritans, it was 124. Last point. In the South, it was harder to send kids to school, not only for financial reasons, but also because of the distance traveled. Schools, even today, are built based on their locations. How many people live in an area determine how many schools will be sprung up. When I lived in South Dakota, kids would have to be bused sometimes 30 miles one way to get to school and then 30 miles back. In the South, with a low population density of 15 per square mile, it was highly unprofitable to have so many schools. So, like I said, that was one of the things that would increase the lack of literacy in the South is geography and the difficulty sending kids to school. All right, our goal there on chapter 13, once again, was to start understanding some differences between the North and the South so you can kind of get an idea of their mental capacity and also their reasons for possibly going to war later on in the 1860s. See you later.